I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Friends, you're listening to the show right now, and we are so grateful for that. Here you are again, listening to me say my name, the name of the show like you don't know. It's obvious because it's right there on your podcast player, right? Okay, so if you wouldn't mind giving us 5 stars or a like, whatever it is on your format, if you guys could just help spread the word, that goes a long way. And that's how we're starting out the show today. Yes, I was just thinking we haven't done any panhandling for love lately. But if you could, give us some stars there. And why? Because we have good shows, because we have good guests. Case in point, today's show, Robert K.D. Colby discussing his book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. We recorded this last summer. Bob was out, but I had the honor of recording this with my good friend and Civil War expert, Tim Talbott. Seemed like last week we got a great response to our conversation with Anderson Carmen and Andrew Fialka on their graphic novel in the Civil War. We're doing a re-air this week, and I thought let's keep it rolling with that theme. It's a great episode, like so many in our back catalog, but for those of you guys who love the re-airs, alas, we're going to be back with new episodes next week. After that, our lineup's great. We'll be back next week with Jake Tapper talking about his new book, Race Against Terror, chasing an Al-Qaeda killer at the dawn of the Forever War. The book is epic. It's a history that reads like a crime novel. Later on, coming up, Ken Burns is coming back on the show. We're excited about that. His American Revolution documentary is coming out soon. Jeffrey Rosen from the Constitution Center. Oh man, that's just some. Our lineup coming up is incredible. And thank you to the patrons. Thank you for keeping the show going. Can't say that enough, even though we say it all the time. Patreon.com/theroadtonow if you want to support the show. Otherwise, again, just to bring this full circle, you could give us 5 stars or a like. Or if you're listening on YouTube, more people listening on YouTube now. Smash that like button, smash that subscribe button is what they say in all my kids' maddening videos he watches of Minecraft. So we won't say that. We'll just say, please help us out. And thank you for supporting the show, listening to it. Spread the word. Have a great week. Take care. I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. And it's a pretty awesome road to now, because this road to now for me personally loops back around to the old days, my old days at Appalachian State University, where I happened to find myself up into the hills of North Carolina and into a group of some of the most fantastic people I've ever been a part of. Joining me today is one of these people, one of the most impressively knowledgeable people I've ever met on the history of the Civil War, my guest co-host for today, Tim Talbott. Tim, how you doing?
Thank you, Ben. It's an honor to be on your podcast.
It's great, dude. And just to introduce Tim, I mean, I hope that most of you guys were impressed by the fact that I really like him. But Tim is the Chief Administrative Officer for the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and founding member and president of the Battle of New Market Heights Memorial and Educational Association. This guy has a long history of public engagement. And since we like to bring the big ideas from the world of the academy to the masses, Tim, you're the ideal co-host.
Humble.
And because Tim's such an expert, this is part of a project that I'm doing while Bob is off promoting some album or something. He's got some other job he said he's got to do. So I have the great fortune of being surrounded by just brilliant people. And so my idea was start with Tim. Tim, give me a book you've read on the Civil War that you think is the most really impressive book that's come out recently. Something you think would be great, a great topic, something you think would fit the road to now. And that is how we found ourselves to today's guest, Dr. Robert K.D. Colby, an assistant professor of history at Ole Miss who specializes in the Civil War and the history of slavery. He's joining us to talk about his new book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, which I think is magnificent. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And so, Tim, you pitched me on this book. Every bit of it was right that you said about it. It's fantastic. So why don't you start off by telling us why you thought Robert was the guy we should have on for this episode?
Well, this book is so important to the Civil War field. Not much, if anything, has been done on the slave trade during the 4 years of the Civil War. So this is groundbreaking stuff. So it's a lot of information out there I think people will need to process and think about. But as they read it, it's so well written and it's so accessible. The stories that are told in this are just fantastic. A lot of times heartbreaking, but so important for us and so relevant for our current times.
I agree. We're airing this episode later today because we didn't plan this. but it is kind of a perfect episode to air the week of Juneteenth, I think. And I think a lot of folks might say, well, you're talking about the dark side of slavery here. Why would we celebrate it? And I'm convinced that you can't celebrate something if you don't realize what you've overcome. And I think that when we talk about looking into that darkness to appreciate the light, when we get into this conversation, you see how entrenched parts of this country were in the slave trade and how many people at the moment, even as the Civil War was going on, they saw no way that slavery was going to end in their lifetime. But then it did. I think there's something to be hopeful for. And even if those around us are resistant of being optimistic, I think sometimes we're reminded that our more pessimistic friends may not be the right ones. So let's get going with this one. Tim, you want to take the opening question?
Sure. So Robert, in my experience as a public historian, it seems like people are often confused about the slave trade. What often comes to people's minds, first of all, is the transatlantic slave trade. Movies like Amistad, those images have come into their minds. And we as historians obviously know how that evolved and changed. But could you explain a little bit about the difference between the transatlantic slave trade versus the internal or domestic slave trade, which is the focus of your book?
Yeah, that's a great point. So my book focuses on the United States' domestic slave trade, which is to say the slave trade as it was practiced within the United States. But it's very closely related in many ways to the Atlantic slave trade in the sense that the domestic slave trade mostly comes into existence after the United States bans Americans from participating in the Atlantic slave trade. The Constitution had allowed Congress to do so in the original text of the Constitution, and in 1808, Congress prohibits Americans from taking part in the Atlantic slave trade. The thing, which does a couple of things, but this coincides with the rise of cotton as a major crop in the United States, as arguably the most valuable crop in the United States. And so as slaveholders, as white Southerners move to the South and the West, move to new areas, open new areas to cotton production, they largely want to use enslaved laborers to plant, to harvest, to produce cotton. What the closure of the Atlantic slave trade does is it limits the availability of enslaved laborers to those who are already in the United States. And so to supply this need, to move people from places like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, later Kentucky, Missouri, in the upper South, to the cotton frontiers of the lower South, this domestic slave trade emerges to meet that economic need. Fairly quickly, it becomes professionalized. People who are identifiably professional slave traders are on the scene by the early 1800s. By the 1820s, by the 1830s, it's a recognizable, highly developed business that exists essentially. And the way it basically works is that a slave trader can buy an enslaved person for a relatively lower price in let's just say in a place like Virginia, and sell that person for a higher price in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. Pick your state. They evolve depending on when we're talking about. And they can sell that person in that place for a high enough price to not only to cover the costs of moving that person from one to another, but to make a profit in the business in the process. And so the domestic slave trade emerges, and it very quickly attains a huge scale across the first decades of the 19th century. Between the closure of the Atlantic slave trade and the outbreak of the Civil War, we don't have a great number for how many people white Southerners buy and sell and move, but it's probably in the neighborhood of at least 500,000, probably closer to 700,000 to 800,000. We're talking about a huge number of people. And then probably a similar number white Southerners buy and sell and move locally within a state, within a county, within a city. So there's an enormous business being done in the purchase and sale of human beings in the antebellum South.
Tim, I think it's interesting the way that the memory Americans have. It's a weird kind of going different directions. Whereas I think most Americans imagine the slave trade is always the transatlantic slave trade. They also tend to imagine that slavery was always producing cotton, right? So it's kind of this weird disconnect there because cotton is not the original crop. You got tobacco, you got rice and things like that. Cotton fundamentally changes this process. And I think it's important to get the Deep South with New Orleans as the port. This is the center of all of this. And a lot of the failing plantations, they stay afloat by actually selling off the children of enslaved people from their own plantations, right, Robert?
Yeah, so they certainly sell people, but also, the fact that even if they don't actually sell huge numbers of people, the people they enslave rise in value on the theoretical possibility that they could be sold. I was just looking at some letters from Thomas Jefferson, right? And Thomas Jefferson, when he calculates the value of his property, like taken as a whole, he builds in 5 to 10% growth for the increasing price of the people he enslaves. Whether or not he actually sells them, they're simply worth more because there's growing demand from the cotton states. And theoretically, they could be sold. And so they have a higher value, even if they never are.
The thing your book does that strikes me is the way that people who were engaged in the slave trade, the human beings are just another box on a spreadsheet. If you could look at what's going on in 1860 with the fear about slavery ending, and then you look at the slave traders themselves, and they're going, I think it'll be fine, right? Many of them believe that the trade's going to go on. It's like you're looking at Wall Street in 2008. But these are human beings, and this tells us something about the system here. So could you talk about this moment? Where are we standing on this cusp of the Civil War? What does the slave market look like? And please talk about how powerful these slave trading firms are.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting point. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was often struck me in doing this research is you can read a letter from it doesn't have to be a professional slave trader. It could be anyone who's looking to buy or sell a person. And you can, there were numerous times where I was reading a letter and it was very difficult to tell if they were talking about a person or an inanimate object. For example, I had to stop and think, okay, they've given sort of a personal name, let's say Bob, right? And I have to it takes me several paragraphs into a letter sometimes to tell if Bob is a person or a horse, which I think is telling in and of itself. There was a similar letter where I forget the exact name. It was a woman's name. And I read most of the letter and I thought that it was talking about a woman. It turns out eventually they're talking about a boat. But it's you're talking about people being treated interchangeably as commodities, right? As anything else that could be bought and sold. And it's really alarming as you read these letters. To talk about the slave trade. So the slave trade in 1860 is pretty close to the most robust it's ever been. You could make a case for the mid 1830s as the peak of the slave trade. It's when cotton achieved some of its highest prices ever. But the business is going gangbusters in the 1850s as well. And white Southerners feel remarkably confident. There had been a financial crisis in 1857 that had really racked the country as a whole, but had barely touched the business of slavery. And so white Southerners come out of that very confident in sort of the trajectory of the slave economy. By the same token, you have to realize slave prices, the prices offered for enslaved people had risen constantly for about 15 years ahead of the Civil War, to the point that even slaveholders were surprised by the prices that enslaved people were going for. I remember reading a letter from the winter of 1860 where a white Southerner, I think someone from South Carolina, says, how is it possible that people can be sold at these prices? They can't be producing cotton enough to make it worthwhile, and yet they do. So there are people who, even in 1860, are looking at this and saying, there's probably what we would call a bubble in the prices offered for enslaved people, but there's sort of this growing mania to acquire them. That runs sort of headlong into the tensions, or that rather, I should say that sits alongside growing discomfort that white Southerners had been feeling in the 1850s about the place of slavery in the United States, particularly given the rise of an avowedly anti-slavery Republican Party, whose platform is just filled with things that could theoretically hurt the value of enslaved property, banning slavery from the Western territories. Republicans talk frequently about using the Congress's power over interstate commerce to ban the slave trade. It's unclear if this is constitutional. The Supreme Court had sort of given a hazy ruling on this in the early 1840s, but the Republicans and said that Congress couldn't ban the slave trade. But the Republicans come back to this nevertheless in the late 1850s. They're talking about banning slavery in Washington, D.C. And so, and even what sort of is more worrying to white Southerners in the long term is it's in some ways the auxiliary effects of the slave trade itself, which is to say they see states like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, where the percentage of the population that is enslaved is decreasing, partly due to white in-migration, but partially also because the net effect of decades of slave trading has been to remove large percentages of those states' Black population into places like Louisiana, Mississippi, now as we hit the 1850s, Texas and Arkansas. And so they look at these states and they say, states that had long been committed to the defense of slavery politically are no longer as reliable as they once had been. If we wait 10 to 15 years, if we let a Republican administration get power, the same thing might happen to, say, Virginia or Tennessee or North Carolina. And so even though this is a moment where slave prices have never been higher, where white Southerners are on one hand remarkably confident, on the other hand, they look ahead and they see some real potential problems in their future. And so that's part of this concern over what a Republican administration particularly might mean for the future of slavery is one of the things that is the major thing that drives them to push to secede in 1860.
On the surface, it's pretty easy to see how the slave trade could be an economic driver. But as you describe in your book, there's a lot of tentacles that go out from that as well. Slave traders are relying on people to manufacture clothing or the people they sell. People are placing advertisements in newspapers. People are buying insurance on these enslaved peoples to ensure their investment. Could you talk a little bit more about slavery as an institution, as an economic driver?
Yeah. So the slave trade is really important. It's critical to the institution of slavery because its existence puts a price on every enslaved person, which then radiates outward into the economy in a couple of ways. As you say, everywhere that there are slave traders, they have auxiliary businesses that spring up to serve them. So I spent a lot of time reading the account books of a Richmond slave trader named Hector Davis, who regularly keeps people in his jail, often for extended periods of time, while he sort of waits for the market to come right. Those people have to be fed, they have to be clothed, and you have local women in Richmond, particularly, making clothes to keep them clothed, basically. Alexandra Finley has a great book about sort of what she calls the intimate economy or the household economy of slavery. It's a really great book. But also, you regularly see doctors showing up to serve, to care, and we could put that in scare quotes, probably to preserve the investment in enslaved people. You have regular dealings with Richmond merchants. The other thing that shows up a lot in these accounts is close engagement with banking. Slave traders rely on banks to help finance their businesses, to keep them supplied with the cash that they need to acquire people, to float credit. Purchasers usually rely on credit, often floated by a financial institution. And as you say, Tim, there are also insurance policies. This seems, I'm not sure exactly how widespread this is, but you certainly see them. I will tell you that slave traders I've seen examples of slave traders endorsing insurance companies. And so, yeah, it's really bound up with sort of the local economy. And then as you look more broadly, the fact that the slave trade exists, the fact that people can be bought and sold and have a price, means that, for example, white Southerners can secure loans and mortgages with enslaved people as collateral. There are some estimates that say that in parts of the South, 40% of all mortgages may have enslaved collateral involved. Bonnie Martin has done some really good work on this. And even if it's not explicit, it's often implicit because enslaved people, because of the slave market, are much more liquid property than land is, for example. It's much easier to turn a person into cash than it is land. And so, so the slave trade is just deeply bound up with the Southern economy heading into the Civil War.
Yeah, as you point out, in 1860, enslavers valued the 4 million enslaved Americans at a total of $3 billion, which was more than the value of railroads, capital and banks, and growing industries. That is huge. And I think it's fascinating, too, because it's still not the easiest to liquidate. But you're right. In comparison to land, it is. But this economic system here, and this gets back to a thing that, I'm a Southerner. I grew up in North Carolina, rural North Carolina. You grew up hearing the defenses of slavery, or if not a defense of the Confederacy, I would say, which ultimately leads to being a defense of slavery. But you hear the people who the apologists, and one of the big things is the whole dismissal of Lincoln. It was a violent, this violent war that didn't need to happen. One of the things I used to always hear people would say, slavery was going to go away no matter what. And I think that, boy, if this coffin isn't already buried in the ground, you put the last nail in it with this topic, because we're talking about people trying to sell enslaved people days before Richmond is taken, the capital of the Confederacy. And this gets at a really important point here. Slavery is not just this economic system. It is that. But the political institutions at a time when the federal government is not that strong, state institutions with formal, with laws, their informal institutions, the cultures, all of this is so deeply rooted in slavery that it's not just the money. It's almost unimaginable for people to think of a future without slavery in it. And this disconnect is fascinating to me, because you're right. I've always said that America blames the South for the Civil War and racism, and we'd be better off to look everywhere for it. It's been a coping strategy, not to say we're not culpable in the South, but just to say maybe some people were part of it too. And you go back to, I'm not a scholar like you guys, but McPherson, right? One of my favorite parts of reading Battle Cry of Freedom is the part where they talk about the Nashville conventions. You guys, where Southerners are like, why are we reading books from all up north? Why are all the best books and the best newspapers? Why are all the shipping companies coming? Why are all the bankers up? Why is it all? And they're like, all the great cultural innovations and all these innovations are coming from the north. And they get together in Nashville a couple of times. And some people are like, well, maybe it's because you don't let nobody in the South learn how to read. And they're like, what do these people need to learn how to read for? You don't need to learn how to read for. They're so rigid. And their culture and their laws are so bound up in defending slavery that they don't create opportunities for other forms of economic growth. So beyond what I've just said, could you talk more about this, examples of how this is so dug in that the future without slavery is almost unimaginable?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, right? And sort of I feel like the pinnacle of this sort of rhetoric is James Henry Hamden's "Cotton is King" speech, which he gives in 1857, again, right as this financial crisis is racking the country, and he rails at length about how slavery is the superior social institution, that it sets society on the basis on which it ought to be stood, that it's the basis on which it's if you're this is less than 10 years after the Communist Manifesto, but it's the answer to struggles between capital and labor. It's the proper setting for American democracy, right? This is a worldview based on the idea that there is a hierarchy, and that slavery appropriately subordinates a group of people who can and should be subordinated. What I think is interesting, though, is that and this is something that really struck me as I was writing this book, is that so much of the writing on slavery and the slave trade has focused on the economic side of it, and with good reason, right? This is clearly, as we've discussed so far, this is an enormous business. But I was struck by the degree to which it absolutely requires governmental authority to function. Slavery, because slavery requires reducing people to property, enslaved people are a unique form of property. And Southern law has to reckon with this, that enslaved people are both people and property at the same time. And in a way that other forms of property are not, enslaved people constantly contest that status, right? They by flight, by resistance, by legal petition in many cases, for example. And so to keep, in a way that is not true of, let's say a land, people have to be constantly kept as property. And that requires laws, that requires force, and it requires constant effort on the part of an entire society to keep this idea normalized. And on the one hand, you have in the late 1850s, you have people like Hammond talking about how strong this is, how it's so natural, and it's slavery makes the slaveholding South stronger than any other part of the country. But on the other hand, the reliance that slavery has on the government makes it fairly fragile in some ways. And that's one of the things that the Civil War shows very clearly. Wherever slaveholders' power is fractured, the slave trade almost immediately disappears, for example. In a place like New Orleans, right? You mentioned New Orleans is the hub of the antebellum slave trade. It's the major port city for the Cotton South. Probably, we think somewhere 110, 120,000 people are sold through New Orleans in the antebellum period. It is the largest slave market in the United States. And yet, less than a year into the Civil War, it basically ceases to function as a slave market because Union soldiers occupied it. And even though slavery remains legal in New Orleans and the surrounding parts of Louisiana, famously, those areas will even be exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation, the uncertainty, right? It's unclear. Union soldiers might have a legal or theoretical responsibility to uphold parts of slavery, but are they actually going to do it? It's very unclear, right? I remember reading on some military records from New Orleans, and one day a group Union soldiers may help jail a group of enslaved people, but literally the very next day they won't. And that makes white Southerners very reluctant. White Southerners in areas occupied by Union forces very reluctant to invest, to expend what is increasingly precious capital on enslaved people. And so there's a fragility there, right? There's a fragility in when you rely on the law, when you rely on force to keep people as property, when there is a countervailing force, that becomes much more difficult. And so, wherever the Union Army goes, their action, or we might say inaction, combined with, that constant pressure from enslaved people in pursuit of their own liberation, makes it very difficult to continue the slave trade.
It's fascinating. Tim?
One of the things that your book does a really good job of, I think, is keeping people, individuals, as kind of you're framing a whole big idea, but you're also telling and making arguments through the examples and the evidence you find of individual people. And you're do a wonderful job of storytelling through individuals' actions and their expressions of agency throughout this book. Could you tell a little bit more about, or speak a little bit to that fact of how you were able to find these individual stories and the research process that you went through to dig and find so much? I mean, you make a mountain of evidence in this book, and it's so impressive.
Yeah, and for those of you guys listening, I just want to tag on to Tim's thing to say, the history of slavery is notoriously hard to get at when you want to tell the stories of enslaved people. And somehow in the hardest period to find this evidence, Robert has found stories relating to at least 2,000 transactions, many of which have qualitatively rich stories that are attached to them. So it's really impressive.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you feel that way, because it was a real challenge in writing this book. Because one of the reasons I think that this book, Tim, as well as anybody, how many books there are about the Civil War. I think all the time about if you go to Ford's Theater in Washington, the multi-story stack of books they have about Abraham Lincoln, for example. And so it is really hard to find something that's relatively unexplored. And I think one of the reasons that very few people have touched this topic. There are a handful of essays about it, but that's about it. Is because the evidence is so fragmentary. There, on the one hand, it's everywhere. If once you have this sort of lens in your hand, if you go to read a collection of Civil War letters, I won't guarantee you'll find something, but you stand a pretty good chance of finding something that's related to the slave trade, whether that's an enslaved person coming into Union lines and explaining, I fled because I was afraid I was going to be sold, or whether it's a Confederate soldier discussing with his wife how to handle enslaved people back home. It is everywhere, but it's often an offhanded reference in a letter. It's often a bill of sale with no context, and so it's a very challenging. I found it a very challenging topic to get at in a consistent way, because there's very few, I should say, large collections devoted to the slave trade during the Civil War. You can't walk into the National Archives and say, show me all of your slave transactions during the Civil War. If you could, it would have made my life a lot easier. But one of the beauties of working in the age that we're in, especially with the amount of things that have begun to be digitized, is in a way that wasn't always possible before. There is the opportunity, at least, to piece together stories that have rested for decades in archives that might be separated by hundreds of miles. And so in some cases I was able to say, okay, I have I have a record of this person being sold in this place. Now with the digital availability of Freedmen's Bureau records, for example, I can go and look in the place where I think this person might have been sold and see if there's any trace of them there. And that doesn't always work. In fact, I would say most of the time it doesn't, but sometimes it does. And you can follow someone's movement through the wartime slave trade. You can encounter their experiences, in some cases, after the Civil War. And so thanks to the increasing digitized newspapers are really helpful here as well. And so you can, in a way that I don't think would have been possible or would have been extremely difficult even 10 years ago, it's possible to trace people through a growing digital archive or to find hints in physical archives that weren't possible before. So I was fortunate to be onto this topic in a moment when that's growing increasingly possible. And I will plug here, just for your listeners, I mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau records. The Smithsonian Institution is hosting the Freedmen's Bureau records are the records of this agency the government created at the tail end of the Civil War to help people transition from slavery to freedom. Their records are enormous. I think there's something like 8 million pages of Freedmen's Bureau records, but they are incredibly detailed. And one of the things that I continually refer back to is this agency helps Black families find each other after the Civil War. But I should say the Smithsonian is hosting an ongoing transcription project. You can just jump in and take a page of handwritten letters, take a page, from a ledger, whatever, and transcribe it. And every little bit makes these records more usable. They're tremendous for African-American genealogy, for example. And so I will plug that project as one that I found incredibly useful and that I think is an amazing example of what's possible now that wasn't before.
And let me tell you this, Robert, before we go, I got to get that link from you because I want to put that in the episode description for anyone who wants to contribute. Literally, you just offered to people an opportunity to contribute to documenting our history. That's incredible. So another thing you did I think is interesting with the sources is you went back to the WPA interview projects. And we had Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers on last year to talk about how that allowed her to find stories of women in slavery. And but for a long time, people were kind of doubted those sources, right? And there's been some suspicion or, all this. Could you talk about that? Because this does get into the problem that all the sources we're talking about, we talked about literacy earlier, about the low literacy rates in the South. But this is something I learned from Tim Talbott, that there's so many letters from the Civil War because it's the first time you have a lot of literate soldiers on the battlefield, right? More than normal. Like, the Revolutionary War, people don't have shoes, much less ability to read and write. So you have an abundance of sources by, average soldiers. In the meantime, the enslaved population is not only circumstantially illiterate, they're literally legally prohibited from becoming literate in most places. So while you have access into kind of common people with the soldiers, the white soldiers, it's still hard to find records left behind by Black Americans themselves going through slavery. So could you talk about how the WA Project helps you with that and how, it plays a role within the greater story you're telling?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm glad you brought up Stephanie Jones-Rogers because I learned a great deal from the ways in which she used these records in her book. And especially the way that she talks about memory and the types of memories that are particularly salient in these records. So right, the WPA interviews are these interviews done in the late 1930s with formerly enslaved people by people hired by the Works Progress Administration, the New Deal agency. And you can imagine the challenges that exist with them, both the fact that many of the people interviewed are quite elderly, and talking about events that had taken place 70 years earlier. And so I will say that as I used them, I tried to be extremely careful. And I tried to, where I used them, I was very careful to only talk about things that the interviewees specifically dated to the Civil War, where because an enormous number of these interviews talk about being bought and sold, and you could make the argument based on the age of the participants that it must have been during the Civil War. But I tried to be very careful only to say, they often say, for example, a few weeks before the surrender. So they're dating it to just before Appomattox or whatever the sort of local capitulation was. Right before the fall of Nashville or Memphis or Natchez or take whatever city you want. Or transactions that engaged that directly pertain to the Civil War. So I think of a woman from the Columbus, Georgia area who remembered that her family had been sold so that their enslaver could raise money to hire a substitute to take his place in the Confederate Army, right? That's something that's very clearly tied to the Civil War. And it's just not the kind of memory, it's the kind of memory you can imagine lodging in a person's brain and remaining with them for decades thereafter. I will also say that I tried to be very circumspect and only use narratives to sort of reinforce things that I was already seeing in the record. I tried not to rely solely on them to make a point, but rather where they were corroborated or seemed to be corroborated by contemporary documents is where I used them most heavily. But they're an interesting source. They're a challenging source. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's a specific person's experience and what is sort of a broader cultural memory, for example. But certainly they provide vivid descriptions of what the experience of being bought and sold during the Civil War.
Staying on the source stream, one of the things I really liked about the book as well is you didn't talk just about the big slave traders, your Hector Davises, your Silas Omohundros, your Hill Dickinson companies. You also talked about slave trades going on between individuals. And a number of those individuals that you include are some pretty well-known, at least within the Civil War community, well-known Confederate officers. You mentioned people like Edward Porter Alexander, William Dorsey Pender, Stephen Dodson, I'm sure Paul Sims. These are people that Civil War enthusiasts are well aware of, but they're probably not well aware that they're, trading individuals, to hedge their bets on the future of their success and their fortunes. And those things are probably out in clear daylight in their papers, but until somebody brings them forward, like yourself, people don't see those individuals in this particular light. Can you talk a little bit more about those individuals you found mentioning this in their correspondence?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, one of the reasons I think that this isn't the foremost thing that shows up in, for example, the discussion of Edward Porter Alexander, one of Lee's leading artillery officers. His memoirs are, famous, edited by Gary Gallagher. They're an extraordinary source. But of course, this isn't something he talks about in his memoirs, right? It's not of interest to the audience he's writing to when he's writing in the early 20th century, or, late 19th, early 20th century. It's not something that, I think if I recall correctly, he starts writing his memoirs for his children. It's probably not something he wants to highlight for them. And yet this was one of the most sort of striking things that I found. I was going through his papers at UNC, which is also where sort of the early drafts of his memoir are. And, right there, a month after Gettysburg, Alexander is writing to his wife, and they're talking about whether or not to purchase an enslaved woman, which I think says a couple of things. One is, we tend to focus on sort of the military lives of these men, but they have personal lives that are unfolding, at exactly the same time that they're contemplating what their next move on the battlefield will be. In fact, right, we probably don't talk enough, but I remember having it drilled into my head in my Civil War classes that Civil War soldiers spend most of their time in camp, right? And so they spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening at home, and those connections between the home front and the battlefield are constantly reinforced by correspondence. So I think, and at one level, their constant attention to the slave market underscores that the Confederate battlefield is very closely tied to the home front. And then the second thing has to do with how they see this as sort of a barometer, and not everyone comments on this, but many Confederate officers, they kind of are weighing engagement, whether or not to buy and sell people, in conjunction with how they feel affairs are going on the battlefield. On the one hand, for example, I came across a letter in the North Carolina State Archives from D.H. Hill to his wife, where he tells her, don't buy slaves. Don't put money in banks. The only thing we want to hold is land, because that'll be the hardest thing for the U.S. government to confiscate when the war is over, right? So that's right before the 7 days. Things are looking pretty bleak for the Confederacy in that moment. On the other hand, you have Porter Alexander, right after Gettysburg, right after Vicksburg. He's still talking to his wife about buying an enslaved woman. They ultimately decide not to, but it's not because they think things are going that badly for the Confederacy. It just doesn't really make sense for their family at that moment. In fact, he talks about the woman as a tempting speculation in that moment, which squares fairly well with what we know of Alexander's evaluation of the course of the Civil War. Alexander tends to downplay the significance of Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And so in some ways, looking at how they think about the slave trade reinforces or dovetails well with how we think about the relationship between military events and the Confederacy's fate writ large.
So this is something that's interesting to me. I just suspect, based on my general knowledge of the zeitgeist of the Civil War, that I might understand this. But Tim, you say that these officers here, that their relationship to buying and selling individuals has kind of been kept under the radar. Is this part of this kind of greater, like this aloofness that people who fetishize the Confederacy have, where they want to separate the honor of the officers and their dedication in the war from the institution of slavery? and thus therefore pointing out the fact that these folks are buying and selling as they're going. And perhaps if we're talking about markets, insider trading, Robert, by knowing information before anybody else does. Is this a part of like trying to maintain the decorum around these individuals so as to separate their lives from the institution of slavery in its defense?
I think this is all part of that school of thought after the war that emerged called the lost cause. And what they're trying to do is distance themselves from slavery as being the reason for the war. And they're trying to upplay the bravery, the honor, the courage of their soldiers on the battlefield. So yeah, anything that can really be done to distance those really strong pieces of evidence that ties individuals to slavery are often being ignored when they're writing the histories in the late 19th century into the 20th century, sometimes on up until the present. So yeah, I think that's all part of that lost cause, trying to separate themselves and distance themselves from slavery and its story.
I think that's right. I think I would add that sort of squares with sort of the evidence issues that I mentioned earlier. So a lot of it, I think, does depend on sort of the lens with which you're reading these people's letters, right? If you're reading these letters with a lens that downplays the importance of slavery in the Civil War, it's pretty easy to skim over, for example, the handful of letters in Stephen Dodson and Ramser's published letters that talk about this. But if once you're attuned to that, and once you're looking for it, right? So if you've been sort of brought up in a mentality, if you've been taught that the Civil War was not about slavery, you can miss it, right? I think you can be sort of forgiven for reading past it. But once you start looking for it, once you're attuned to that, right? It's everywhere. You see the letters where Ramser is writing to his brother, talking about whether or not it's a good time to buy people, right? And I think that it's been easy for a long time to look past that. And I think it's just important for us to read those letters sort of in their totality. Yeah.
Your book brings another great thing too, is it reminds us not to look at history with hindsight. These people are fully expecting for the Confederacy to establish an independent nation. They can't imagine a world outside of them achieving their goal. I think of Jason Phillips' book, Die Hard Rebels, which is a great book. It's just beyond them. Now, there's some people, of course, that are deserting late in the war. Soldiers. There's some people on the home front that are really, have given up hope, but there's a whole lot of them that are banking everything on the success of this endeavor in creating a new nation, which is going to be based on slaveholding, and they're placing their bets on that big move. So that's another thing that I thought really stood out in your book, is this importance of, instead of looking at it as we know Appomattox is going to happen in 1865, these people right up until Appomattox are expecting them to succeed. Not secede, but succeed.
Yeah, already seceded, now on to secession. It's like, actually, it was both failures. It didn't work. It's that story, your opening story, Robert, like, this is such a great hook that there's a Wall Street in Richmond, and it's lined with traders. But the Wall Street in Richmond, it's traders of human beings. And as it's about to fall, the capital is about to fall, the slave trader is trying to get his enslaved people out of the city, because they're like, well, we'll just go back down. I guess we'll go down to, go down to Alabama, wherever, go back down to Montgomery. And it's just, I don't know, the dedication to it. Tim, I don't know if I ever told you this, one of my favorite things. And Robert, I'm from Concord, Mount Pleasant, North Carolina. So Cabarrus County. And outside of our library in downtown Concord, there's a marker. I can't remember the exact date, but it's like late April. And the marker says, I think it's April 25th, 1865. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his staff camped within a half mile of this location. It's like on their way to, and it doesn't say what they were doing. You know what I'm saying? It's like, well, what were they doing down there? Well, they were running is what they were doing. They only stayed one night for a reason. And, but they're running. And this guy with these enslaved people, even as the capital's fallen, even as people have kind of known the Confederacy couldn't win from the end of 1864, He's still like, well, I just get these enslaved people out of here. We'll keep going somewhere else. That is not the type of attitude that leads to slavery just going away, in a couple of years anyway.
No, I mean, I and what's striking is that, so we're talking about, in this case, this is Robert Lumpkin, a longtime Richmond slave trader, trying to move, we think, the sources say, about 50 people out of Richmond at the end of the war. But what's telling is he's not the only one who's doing this. Just before Savannah falls to Sherman's forces, there's a pair of Savannah slave traders who try to pull the exact same maneuver. In that case, the enslaved people themselves rise up and severely beat these men, and then sort of melt away into the Georgia winter. But this pretty much happens in some way, shape, or form wherever things look bad for the Confederacy until there is no more Confederacy. What I was struck in Tim, you mentioned Jason Phillips's book, and I think Jason Phillips's book, Die Hard Rebels, is just outstanding. Especially that last chapter where he talks about why in the world Confederates continued to believe they could win in the winter of 1864-65. I mean, it's remarkable. But you see that borne out just in these actions. And I remember one of the letters that made me do a double take was a Virginian wrote to his brother. He'd just bought an enslaved person in early September 1864. And he writes, I believe it's to his brother, and he says, "If I had known Atlanta was going to fall, I probably wouldn't have done this." And then, like 3 lines later, he's back to describing how he's going to go buy more people next year. The disconnect there, right? The degree to which people are unfazed until really late in the war by military defeats, I think is really striking and really telling. The commitment that many white Southerners have to both the Confederacy and the slave trade that it defends is intense and deep.
Yeah, it's rooted. It's bizarre how things that are so clearly products of the state and of coercion can naturalize themselves in ways that make them seem almost unavoidable. You've got so many good stories in here. Before we go, Robert, we've talked a lot about the slave traders and the people who were part of that and the Confederate officers. But you've got some great stories of enslaved people themselves. And like you say, some of these are pretty brutal. They're not stories that, we would necessarily celebrate, even if we can appreciate and celebrate the end of slavery. Your book really doubles down on the fact that for enslaved Americans, this is 4 million people, by the way, we're talking about. I want to remind everybody, we're talking about 60% of the state of South Carolina's population. It's always, I always feel obligated at a moment like this to say, when people say that the South seceded because they were trampling on people's rights, I'd like to remind you that had you asked the people of South Carolina, I suspect 60% of them would have just done away with slavery on their own, but they were never asked. So could you tell one of these stories, a story that highlights this, what enslaved Americans go through? It's this dual trauma of war and of separation and the threat of being sold and uncertainty. Could tell a story that highlights this?
Sure. So I can think of a couple off the top of my head. I think one of the most revealing ones that I came across was a young woman named Kate Drumgold, who was enslaved in just south of Petersburg, Virginia. She would have been pretty young during the Civil War. Hard to place exactly, but probably about 8. And she writes a memoir in the 1890s that mostly focuses on her religious experiences, but talks as well about her family's experiences during the Civil War. And so Kate Drumgold loses her mother to the slave trade during the Civil War. She's one of, I think, 10 daughters. And the family that enslaves her sells her mother during the Civil War. It's another example I mentioned earlier of a woman being sold to raise money so that the man who enslaved her could basically buy his way out of the Confederate Army. She loses 2 other sisters to an estate division. A member of the family that enslaved them dies, and As she tells it, due to his drinking habits, he dies insolvent, and she loses two sisters to this slave trade, which I think speaks to the fact that, as an aside, right, there's all these transactions that directly relate to the war and people's attitudes toward it, but the slaveholding society continues to function, and so these highly routine, in some ways, slave sales also continue to take place. So she's lost multiple family members to the slave trade during the Civil War, and is almost sold herself. As she tells it, slave trader offers her enslaver an extraordinary amount of money, which is telling, right, that someone would offer huge amounts of money for an 8-year-old girl, right? An 8-year-old girl is not worth anything during the Civil War. She's not going to do any work that's going to return that money during the Civil War. What someone is doing when they're offering huge money for an 8-year-old girl is you're saying, I'm going to enslave this person for decades, and then I'm going to own her children. So that tells us that Confederates expect that slavery is going to survive the war, and it's going to survive for a long time. So I think her experience is really telling in those ways. But what also I think is what's remarkable about the story of Kate Drumgold is that her mother comes back. Her mother is one of these people who we don't know exactly how. I found a few references to the Family and Freedmen's Bureau records. We don't know exactly how, but her mother makes her way back to the family after the Civil War. And there's this extraordinary passage in Kate Drumgold's memoir where she talks about, seeing her mother come up over the horizon one morning. She'd been praying for this for years. The family ultimately, through the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, makes its way out of Virginia. They go to New York. And so I think it's this encapsulation of, on the one hand, the Civil War continues the slave trade. It continues to devastate enslaved families. On the other hand, right, it's this moment of real possibility. And many of the people enslaved in the American South define the Civil War's effects through the destruction of the slave trade. That they can no longer be bought and sold is, if nothing else, right, there's a lot that the Civil War doesn't settle. Yeah. But the one thing that it does resolve is that people are no longer a legal fungible form of property, right? And enslaved people celebrate this as the war winds to a close. And they also celebrate the chance to start to unwind, they hope, many of the effects of the slave trade, wartime and otherwise. Those are sort of less immediate. It takes often years to find family members, to the degree that people find them at all. For every Kate Drumgold, there are dozens of people who write to the Freedmen's Bureau looking for family members, and the Freedmen's Bureau says, "Well, we tried and we couldn't find anybody." Right? But I think it shows that that the Civil War historians argue a lot about emancipation, argue a lot about did the Civil War really end slavery? Does what follows after the Civil War, is it just slavery by another name, as Douglas Blackman's book is called? And I think you can make a very compelling case, right, that large elements of the institution of slavery do survive the Civil War. But I was struck by the degree to which enslaved people single out the slave trade as an aspect that didn't, right? And as a signal effect of emancipation is that their families, they can no longer be divided. They can't be bought and sold. So I think Kate Drumgold's story really speaks to, in many ways, a lot of what I'm trying to get at in this book. And it's just a remarkable story.
Yeah, the thing that I always make sure that I highlight in my classes when we talk about American slavery is, you always hear the old line, other people enslaved people. It's not like Americans were the only ones who did it. And I make sure to focus on, the unique nature of American slavery and to really drill in on this point about the fact that slavery is hereditary in the United States. You inherit your parents' status. And I think right now we're recording this. Yesterday was Father's Day. And, 2 days from now is Juneteenth. And there's one hell of a thing to remark upon, right? Because when you're a parent and you live in the slave trade, You know, my son was born, he's 9 years old now. I remember watching him and looking at him, and the amazing thing about a child is to say, who will you be? And every day you see it. And if you're a parent and this institution of slavery and the slave trade exists, that beauty, I can't imagine the crushing sense of knowing what your kid's going to be, knowing that your child is going to be enslaved, and just the power that must have to take one of the most beautiful things that you'll ever experience, which is looking in your kid's own eyes and wondering who you're going to be, and turning it into something that has, by its very nature, like storm clouds over it. So I think right now, since, you know, I think all of us should celebrate overcoming this. I think all of us should be grateful. And even if it hurts, you know, as I've said many times before on this show, if you look into history and it hurts, it's because you care. It's not a bad thing. So with that, this has been a great conversation here, guys. My co-host, Tim Talbott, for the day, special co-host. Tim, where can people find you and come learn from you more?
So we do several events through the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust on preserving battlefields. So you can find me through the cvbt.org website. I'll do quite a few posts on there about instances and examples of things that happened on Central Virginia battlefields. I'm also the book review editor for the Emerging Civil War blog. So you can find me there. Yeah.
There's links in the episode description to what he's working on. And our guest for today, author of this fantastic new book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, just came out in April from Oxford University Press. Robert Colby, where can people find you?
Well, I teach at the University of Mississippi. So I'm happy to, answer emails. My contact information is on my department website. I'm also reasonably active on social media. You can find me on Twitter and so forth. I'm going to come after Tim for a battlefield tour next time I'm in Northern Virginia now.
Robert Colby, I got to say, that was the hardest sell ever. Usually I go, hey, where can people find you? People go, check out this link right here. Go to this website. Robert Colby goes, enroll and come to study at Ole Miss. He goes, how about that? How about you move down here? Hey, but man, if people read this book, I wouldn't blame them. So thanks for being here, guys. Appreciate your time.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Ben Sawyer, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.